All right. We are live with 0 people watching so far. This is completely my nightmare. Hey guys, welcome to whenever you watch this, welcome to Ask a Priest. My office hours. You know, if it were real office hours, I would just hang out and like read until someone showed up and then be like, oh, well, good day to you. You know, like, oh, if no one shows up, I'll just be sitting in my office reading. But it would be super weird if we posted a video of me on YouTube where I was just sitting there reading until someone showed up and asked a question. So we're not going to do that. I got kids around and they're screaming about Captain Underpants and running around, and it's quite a day in Casa Duval. Quite a day in Casa Duval. I do have something to start with until someone asks a question. And that is that I got a message from my friend, longtime listener, often frequent caller, Kathy Baggett. I'm just kidding. I loved that language. Kathy Baggett, who is a friend from the Columbus area, and she throws me some curveballs every time so that I have something to start with, which is great. Kathy asked the question. I talked a little bit about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Abraham and Isaac, and that whole scenario of Abraham binding his son Isaac and the almost killing him. And then, that whole story in chapter 22 of Genesis. And anyway, so I mentioned that in our last podcast. And so she asked this question. She said, I mentioned Abraham and Isaac near the end. So here's her question for today. Imagine as Isaac runs back down the mountain after the lamb was sacrificed, he runs ahead and says to Sarah, you won't believe what that crazy old man did today. What do you think that conversation between Abraham and Sarah was like? Bless you. So the great thing is this has been wondered about over thousands of years. In fact, I have a book that I don't have here. Most of my libraries at work of what's called Midrash. And you, Kathy, almost definitely know what Midrash is. But for those who don't, Midrash is a style of biblical commentary in the Jewish tradition. And in the way the best, who knows if it's the best way I know how to describe it. The best way I know how to describe Midrash is imagine if you're hearing a story in the Bible, like Abraham and Isaac, and you go, well, what do we do with that? And then Midrash is when they would tell stories about the story. The best way to understand a story is by telling more stories. And so Midrash is this really powerful commentary that is really addressing the narrative. How do we deal with the narrative? It's not asking, what does this name mean? And what is this and that? Good afternoon, Mary and Jeff. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the office. I'm talking a little bit about our friend Kathy asked me a question about how Isaac handled almost being killed by his dad, Abraham. And then maybe did he rat Abraham out to mom? And how did that whole thing go down? There's a whole section in this book I have of these Midrash, of these commentaries, these Jewish commentaries that are stories told about the story that try to deal specifically with all of the details that are left out of that beautiful narrative. And including how did Sarah take all this? And so I couldn't answer definitively. We don't get enough of a picture, in my opinion, of Sarah and who she is. But the story is told. And the story is told in a way that would suggest Abraham, that Abraham's not a crazy person, and that Abraham's not acting like a crazy person, which is the toughest thing to handle in that story. And I could do 2 hours just on that story and wouldn't even scratch, I don't think, the surface. So I want to be careful how lightly I talk about the story of Abraham binding Isaac and almost sacrificing him. There's so much there. But what I would say is, there's no way that doesn't have a psychological effect on the family. Right. And I mean, there's so many questions I have about Sarah in particular. I got screaming kids. There's nothing. When it comes to Sarah in particular, there's so many questions I have about how she received these messages from God, and Abraham having all these conversations with God and then going to Sarah and be like, okay, so God says we're moving. We're what? Or, oh, by the way, there's this thing we're going to try out on our kids called circumcision, right? She's like, wait, hold on. And God, and Abraham's like, no, don't worry about it. God told me about it in a dream. I mean, Sarah is just like, oh man, come on, but at this point they've been married for probably 50 years. Cause in the story, she's 75, he's 75 and she's 68 or so when they first are, when God first shows up. Yes, I can't, I'm working right now. So you can ask someone else to open the door. Where's Mom?
She's just going potty.
Oh, I'm glad that's online. I'll be right back. That's the door? Why is he going out that door? No one's out there. He said they don't. I can hear them. I'm recording. It's like literally recording on live stream. Okay. Anyways, Sarah, Abraham, there's so much there that I don't want to give a pat answer. But I think what I would say is what I was reading the liner notes to or it was either the liner notes or a commentary on Bob Dylan's album Blood on the Tracks. And there's a song on Blood on the Tracks called Lily, Rosemary, and the Jack of Hearts. It's about, I think it's 8 minutes long. It's one of those Dylan songs. It's like 8 minutes long and he's telling the story. And I remember reading this thing. It says like, what's fascinating about Lily, Rosemary, and Jack of Hearts is, and in really writ large about the whole album of Blood on the Tracks, the lyrics on that album are not just what Dylan says, but what he leaves out. Like what's in between the story. And Dylan, when he's at his best, is a master of what he leaves out, right? And I know that sounds really like jazzy, like what's really cool is the notes they don't play. Like that can be really obnoxious. But genuinely a really good narrative is powerful, not like it's powerful by what it chooses to tell. And by nature of that, what the narrator chooses to tell, what the narrator's leaving out, what's in that space that creates room for imagination, for creativity, for questioning, for thoughts. That's one of the powerful things about narrative. And there's really fewer narratives that are more powerful than Genesis throughout our entire history of writing, actually, not just the Bible. And the story of Abraham and Isaac and the story of Abraham, just the Abrahamic cycle in Genesis and what's present is really powerful. What's left out creates so much space that is not meant to just be answered simply and with a pat answer. What's powerful is that what's left out gives room for ruminating, for wondering, for questions, for thoughts, and all that stuff. So I think that's a really beautiful thing. And I think we are left to wonder about the relationship between Abraham and Isaac, about the relationship between Abraham and Sarah. What is the cost of the sacrifices that Abraham makes? What does that look like? There's a really phenomenal movie. It was quite controversial, I guess. Some controversial for some Christians because they thought it was inappropriate, controversial for other people because they just didn't like it. But the movie Noah, made by Darren Aronofsky, starring Russell Crowe, how Aronofsky tries to deal with the Noah story and Noah's interactions with God. And so much of what he tries to work out is what's left out and how do we talk about that? Oftentimes in the story of Jesus, when Jesus is portrayed in films, they will take the 4 different gospel accounts and sort of try to bring them all together so that they can create this sort of like as fleshed out a story as possible. But the reality is that if you read each gospel account by themselves, each of them tells their own story, and what it leaves out and what it chooses to emphasizes a completely different understanding of Jesus. I have this dream of making like 4 different Jesus movies, one Matthew, one Mark, one Luke, and one John, and I can go back and forth between having the same person play Jesus in all 4 or having 4 totally different people play Jesus because they're 4 different stories being told in different ways about the same person. So I have kind of different thoughts about that, but the idea would be allowing the story to itself like be what it needs to be and not to try to fill in the blanks, but allow that emptiness allow the emptiness and allow the absence of certain things to create spaces for our imagination. Mary's story, Mary's question, or Mary's statement. I've been thinking a lot about the Israelites walking the seabed as the waters are parted. There is a great story about Nachshon. Someone had to go first. Nachshon crossed first, even though he had great fear. It's a great story. I'll have to look that up. I don't know that story, But you think about things like that. I mean, I love stuff like that. We get so caught up in the like, it's weird how obsessed we are with like if something happened or not. Like, we're really obsessed, Episcopal Church and a lot of mainline Christians, and they get obsessed with like, did it happen? Like, did this happen? Did it really though? And what I think is really interesting is if we can get past did it happen or not, we can actually then go like, but what would it be like to be in the midst of that story, which is the point of stories, right? If every time someone told you a story, you were like, yeah, but did it really happen? You're like, are you paying attention to the story? Like, are you putting yourself in the place of the person telling it? Are you experiencing it? And I think sometimes we get so caught up in like the facticity of it, or the question of facticity, like did it happen or not, that we're not actually interested sometimes in engaging and living inside the truth of it. Right. So like this idea of the waters are parted. Well, someone had to go first. What was that like? Right. What was that like? So I think that's a pretty cool idea. I like that. I get stuck in this a lot. I get caught up when it comes to Jesus and the gospel accounts, and particularly with the gospel according to John, which we were hanging out with in Lent, right? We were hanging out with the gospel according to John in Lent. And is my mic working? I hope so. I hope y'all can hear me. What was so powerful to me in Lent was hearing these stories of John where Jesus is talking with these different people, and really focusing on the conversations. And what's so funny is the way John is written is so fanciful. It's so stylized that and so direct, like trying to make a very specific point about Jesus over and over again throughout the gospel account, that it can feel like once you've come off, if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke beforehand, they're told in such a very similar way that when you come into John, you're like, what is going on here? Is this real? Is this a thing? And what I love about John is when you just dig in and pay attention to the story, the actual conversations that are happening between the people, they come to life, and you can hear people actually saying these things. They feel very, you can find yourself in the midst of them. Shh. We're not yelling, okay? You can find yourself right in the midst of them. And I love that. And I love that if we can let ourselves just sit in the story, if we can allow ourselves to be caught up in the story itself and ask the imaginative questions, the creative questions about what it would be like to be the first person to cross the river, the dry river, or being the person that argues with Jesus in this scenario, or the person who doesn't know how to deal with him, or the person who deals with him just right. Mary Southworth Schaefer says the I wonder questions. Mary is deeply involved. You're deeply involved, as you know, with Godly Play. And I've only been at Godly Play a couple of times, but one thing I know about Godly Play is, it starts from this question of wonder. Instead of saying, again, did this happen? Or like, I wonder what it would be like to be in the midst of this, and allowing that to go places, right? Allowing that I wonder, it opens up a completely different thing. I was part of a church that this was years before seminary. I was part of a church that every Lent they did like a Lenten theme, right? A slogan, and you'd get a gift. Like, you go to church and you get a parting gift, right? And the parting gift, the first year we ever did it, were those foam fingers, like you get at ballparks, that like we're number one foam fingers, but it was a foam finger that was pointing straight up, and it said, give it up, right? Because what are you supposed to do every Lent is give something up. But this time it's like, give it up. And what are we giving up? Like, no, give it up to God. When you've got something, you've got an issue, you give it up to God. And so this idea of giving it up to God, and you had the foam finger. Well, one year they did this thing that was from worry to wonder. Maybe it wasn't a Lenten, maybe it was the whole year theme, but it was the idea of turning from worry to wonder. Like, instead of worrying about something, wondering about something, and training ourselves to go to that space of wonder. Now, I will say sometimes you'll be hanging out with someone and they'll try to do the I wonder thing on you too much. You're like, well, I wonder. And I'm like, are you really wondering? Like, we don't want to use that we want to use wonder as a way to engage and not as a way to distance ourselves, right? We don't want to use wonder as a protective, as an insulator. Like if you're having a conversation with someone and they step out and go, oh, I wonder, right? But wonder as a way for us to engage in scriptures. I think this is a really important dynamic. I think it's really important for us to engage with our scriptures from a place of curiosity and imagination, right? Because think about this: if we're engaging with our scriptures from a place of curiosity and imagination, then we're learning how to engage with God, with the divine, from a place of curiosity and creativity and imagination. And I don't think we're encouraged enough to do that. I don't think we're always aware that that's something we can do, right? So like the idea of approaching God in our conversations with God or our questions about God as from a place where we have permission to be creative and to use our whole hearts and souls and minds in conversation. That obedience to God is not just about following rules, which is how we are trained to think about it, but obedience comes from that Latin obedere, to listen. The idea of listening, of course, has a sort of follow the rules angle, or can, but listening in terms of like the listening we do in a conversation, or the listening we do when we're listening to music, or when we're at the symphony, or when we're at a play or watching a movie. This idea of listening to God, not as simply following blindly or about following orders, but the idea of listening as part of the interactive process, as a mutualistic reality, and a listen for the tune, or listen for the part where I can engage. The idea of engaging with God in this way, that God would want us, that God would seek for us to be creative and imaginative in the way that we engage with God, would then again keep going, right? Then it turns us outward into the world. Like, how do we engage in the world? If our Christian vocation, if our Christian way of being in the world is inherently creative, generative, imaginative, rather than simply sort of safeguarding God, or being cautious because we want to make sure we follow and are appropriately the right kind of people. Think about if the foundational relationship of your life, which is your relationship with God, is based in creativity and imagination, and is a generative act, an act of wonder, and an interactive mutualistic relationship. By the way, I'm not trying to subvert obedience. I'm not trying to subvert the need to obey God, the recognition of Jesus as Lord, the recognition of God as sovereign sort of over our lives, not subverting any of that. I'm actually saying, well, what does it look like to experience God? If we understand our obedience to God in generative, creative terms, right? What does that look like? If we're doing that work, it changes the way that we see God in our lives. And then it changes the way that we interact with the world, right? So then in our interaction with the world, religious things are not simply things that are about sort of like the cautious walking the line to make sure that I'm going the right place when I die, right? Like, you know what I mean? But instead it being about how I respond with my whole heart, with my whole mind, with my whole self, my whole being, the veryness of my being, like how I respond to God in that. Like, it takes imagination to be, I mean, like think about the relationships that you're in right now. marital relationships, friend relationships, work relationships. If you have children, those relationships, any relationship, to really be in that relationship requires creativity. If you're in any kind of relationship that goes beyond just the simple how you doing and the simple like niceties, if you're in any relationship that requires any kind of commitment from you, it requires creativity, it requires resilience, it requires a different aspect of you. You got to give yourself to that relationship. Now, wait a minute. If we take that sort of creative requirement, that requirement for imagination, for ingenuity, and a generative way of being, a sort of a responsive and mutualistic way, if that's true in our daily earthly relationships, and our earthly relationships are sort of like sacramental embodiments of our relationship with God, with the divine, well, then why wouldn't we think that way about our relationship with God, that it would require some sort of creative and imaginative reality, right? So one thing that I keep thinking about here, hold on, Mary Southworth Schaefer says, I always pray, help me to do justice to the gifts that you have given me when I'm doing difficult things. Right. And then if you think about, Mary, doing justice to the gifts that God has given us when we're doing difficult things, the way that we do justice to the gifts we're given is by working them out creatively, by pushing the boundaries of our own understanding, not simply by following by rote a list of things we're supposed to do. There are lists of things. There is a way we're generally supposed to be, right? I mean, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not worship a bunch of other gods, thou shalt not commit adultery. These are good rules. I'm not saying don't pay attention to them. They're good. But to do justice to those, and to do justice to the way that God has gifted us to live in the world, requires us to think creatively, to think proactively, to think, to use our whole selves and our imaginations, right? So I think I keep coming back to this thing. I keep coming back to this idea that there is a secular reality and a spiritual reality, that we talk about secular and spiritual, or secular and religious. This idea that there's this place where God belongs in our thoughts and our minds and our conversations. And then there's this stuff where we just kind of can leave God off to the side, or where religion doesn't belong, so to speak. That's all well and good if you're not actually Christian, genuinely. And I'm not saying that ironically, like if you're not Christian, cool. You can say the God stuff goes here and the non-God stuff goes here. That's fine. Do you. But as a Christian, if you're actually Christian, there's no place God isn't. In the Christian understanding of God, there's no place God isn't. Right? God is fully and actively present in the world today as we know it. However the world is, God is present. And so this idea, the reason I bring it up in this context is that sometimes we get into this mindset of like, this is where God belongs. And the God stuff, the religious stuff, is about moral behavior. It's about how I should be. It's about rules. It's about, and it's of course about like, if there's a God, what that God thinks about the stuff. But then there's the real world. Then there's the real world. Then there's the actual. So like the life I'm living today. And we don't want to let these two things, it's like, I want to keep work at work, sort of, so to speak, right? Like religious stuff over here, and then my real life over here, because I want to be careful. And I also don't want to be one of those holy roller types, those folks that always get the Jesus smile, like the, oh boy, oh brother, I just, yes. Okay, hi buddy. He's home. You don't want to just be these people. We get nervous about being those sort of holy roller types, right? But the reality is that like we're God is a part of every aspect of our lives. And it's not about being a holy roller, and it's not about always walking through life being like, thanks be to God for this, thanks be to God for that. It's about how we recognize the holiness of every aspect of who we are, the holistic nature of our life, the wholeness of every aspect of who we are. That there's not a place that God isn't. There's not something that there's not something in your heart, a concern, for instance, that's so small that God doesn't care about it. There's not a part of you that's like, oh, that doesn't matter to God. Because that's my biggest concern about the secular stuff. When we talk about secular stuff that doesn't, is that there's this idea that things don't concern God. That there's a part of you that doesn't matter. That doesn't work for me, right? Like that doesn't track, right? Like every part of you matters. And every part of your life is precious. And every part of your life is meant to be seen as a part of your life with God. And if you really want to buy into that, well, it takes creativity. It takes imagination. You have to, there's some quote, Oscar Wilde. I read a lot of Oscar Wilde in high school and college, and I haven't read a lot since. So it's like 20 years ago memory trying to come out. But I remember in one of his, and I think it's a letter he wrote from prison, from Reading Gaol, where he was imprisoned. He wrote a letter called De Profundis, which was to his ex-lover, I think. And in the letter, one of the things he says is, if you really want to understand how to love, you have to have an imagination. Like you can't really love if you don't have imagination. That real love takes imagination. And that's stuck with me. Like I'm not probably giving it its due because it's Oscar Wilde, so it's probably said perfectly, right? But this idea of real love, of like real love, requiring us to like think creatively, to work in the world in a really powerful way, a wholehearted way. Joyce, who I work with, I had to pull out my online dictionary when I talk to Joyce because her vocabulary is immense and intentional. She uses words very intentionally. And she was talking about needing to have a more fulsome conversation. And I was like, yes, I totally agree. And while I was saying that, I was like pulling out my phone and Googling fulsome because I wanted to make sure. I thought I knew what it meant, right? Like I say fulsome, and you're either thinking like Folsom Prison Blues, or you're like, oh yes, a fulsome conversation. But I was like, I had to look it up, and and one version of fulsome is actually like sort of almost like excessively dear, like you don't like, it's like people like you're too, almost like you're being so effusive in your praise that you're like Eddie Haskell, like no one, we don't buy it. But the other definition of fulsome, which is the one she meant, was like a more generous and like set aside space, like intentional and more encompassing, generative, like, generous conversation. And I was like, fulsome, right? So the idea of that kind of approaching our relationship with God with that fulsomeness, with an intention for space and openness. Yeah. I just talked for 30 minutes without stopping about all sorts of things, starting with Abraham and Isaac and the parting of the sea and godly play and wonder. So I'm going to take a sip of my drink and give you an opportunity to ask more questions. John Hensel might be watching. John, if you're watching, thanks for watching. Hope you're feeling better. I wish you the best. I hope you get out of the hospital soon, right? And know that you're in our prayers. Yes, I've got my Diet Coke. It's a can. I prefer the bottles, but we just got some more bottles and they're not cold yet, so I'm drinking the cans. But God forbid I don't have caffeine going through me at every single moment of the day. So, how are y'all doing? You guys hanging in there? It's funny to have these events at specific times throughout the week. The reason it's funny is it acts like there are actual days anymore. and actual hours that exist. We're like pretending that there's like, I'm like, when should we do these things? And then we just have to like pretend that there's a right, like that people are on, I mean, I guess some people are on schedules. I shouldn't say that. I know that some people are like working remotely and have very specific schedules. Mary says this has been helpful for that. For me too. It marks that this is a time of day. The first week that we were not in the office, hey Betsy, the first week that we were not in the office was just like, I mean, we had a bunch of stuff to do and we were working, like just trying to get up and running and get stuff happening and make it seem like we knew anything at all about anything. But it also was just like this sort of like mass of days that just sort of felt like just day in, day out. Like you wake up and you just get in front of the computer and try to figure things out and make phone calls and then pass out and didn't know what was going on. And then it took a couple weeks before we felt like we actually had an actual schedule. Yeah, vortex, like where there is nothing but just like this quarantine sort of this new status quo being emerging. And I was just sort of caught up in it and not really allowing myself any kind of space to understand what was what. And we were really trying to figure out how to keep our kids from just yelling. I don't need to pretend that they're not here. That's totally fine. I got kids here, you know that, but they don't understand sometimes how to just like be. And it's not like they're not getting out and running around or getting to do what they want to do. It's just literally every time I turn on the camera, it's like they're like, now's the perfect time to yell some things. That's what we're dealing with here. But we have been trying to create a schedule. We have been trying to create some kind of like, give some kind of rhythm to your day. Betsy's handling that with puzzles. She's letting puzzles and catching up on television shows. But Betsy will always take your television recommendations if you've got them. So I wonder what Betsy's been watching lately, because she usually has a pretty good list of shows and she's not afraid to try new things. But I'm still trying to figure out how to create some sense of rhythm. Joyce and I were talking earlier today about just how important Sunday mornings is in our lives. I mean, I guess that seems obvious, like we're priests, of course it is, but genuinely for those of us who go to church all the time, I mean, it cannot be overstated how much of a part of our rhythm that is, how much a part of our weekly, like it defines our weeks. And so to have that taken away, it's really hard, right? And you can't really, like, nature abhors a vacuum, but what's the vacuum? Like, I don't know what goes there. I'm trying to find a weekly rhythm. We've kind of found a daily rhythm, kind of, right? But then how do you distinguish one day from the next? And how do you distinguish weekdays from weekends in this current context is really, really tough, right? Really tough. And I don't have an answer yet. I'm going to try to take tomorrow off, but then I'm not, you know where I'll be, right? So I'll be right here. But we'll see. One thing I'm curious about is how we can be there for each other, right? Continuing to be there for each other and what that looks like. Like I really want to make sure that we as a church community are being there for each other in a way that's meaningful, and that people feel like they're actually being cared for and like in a real way. So if you have thoughts on that, please do let me know. I mean, one of the things that we wanted to do with Ask a Priest is just simply to have one more space where we can talk informally and people can ask questions and check in. Mary Schaefer asks the question, what is your favorite psalm? And this is one of those spaces where buddy, what's up? Oh, okay. He's Captain America over here. What is my favorite psalm? I wish I was more like clever, is what I want to say, right? Like I wish I had like this really cool choice. I think my favorite psalm is Psalm 121. It was a psalm that is read at funerals quite often, and we have it also at noonday prayer. And it just always works. Like Psalm 121 is just always there for me. But I do like 139. I'll read you 121. And then I'm going to tell you about 139 as well. I love 139. But 121, I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where is my help to come? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved, and he who watches over you will not fall asleep. Behold, he who keeps watch over Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord himself watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand, so that the sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve you from all evil. It is he who shall keep you safe. The Lord shall watch over your going out and your coming in from this time forth forevermore. So something that I love about, there's a bunch of stuff I love about that. But the idea that it's a chosen for a funeral, and the first time I really paid attention to it was at my own dad's memorial service. But the idea that it's chosen for a funeral reading, the thing that I keep coming back to is that last line: "The Lord shall watch over your going out and your coming in." And the idea of hearing that in a funeral was really interesting, because I always think about like coming into this world and going out of this world. But hearing it at a funeral and hearing the context of your going out and your coming in, it made me feel like death is a return. Like if this was a psalm that was for the person who had died, not just for us, but for the person who had died, the idea that like you're going out and then you're coming in, and your coming in is a return. Like you go out into the day and then you come back at the end of the day. But the idea of like the end of the day being the end of your life and you're coming back in. And thinking of your death as that returning to God rather than as a departing, primarily as a departing from this world. I think there's some theological issues with that I'm still working through. I don't believe in the pre-existence of souls, right? So I don't believe you and I didn't exist forever. And then just there's the Mormon idea is that the soul existed before being here. But the Orthodox, the traditional Nicene Trinitarian Christian view would be that we didn't exist beforehand. We come into existence. God is the only thing that exists eternally. So we didn't exist, and then now we do. And so that's a theological issue, but you didn't ask about that. The other thing that I love, Psalm, I said already, what did I say? Psalm 130. Nope, not that one. I said it and then I lost it. Oh, well. Whichever one. Oh, 139. Right? Lord, you've searched me out and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You trace my journeys and my resting places and are acquainted with all my ways. Indeed, there is not a word on my lips, but you, O Lord, know it altogether. You press upon me behind and before and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain to it. So I love, it starts with this, the breadth and the just the immensity of God's godness. And my inability to comprehend, but the presence is there regardless of my comprehension. But then, where can I go then from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I climb up to heaven, you are there. If I make the grave my bed, you are there also. And this was a place that first helped me understand the idea of how low can you go, that you could go so low that God couldn't be. There's nowhere you could go. And that language, if I make the grave my bed, it's other translations, or if I make the pit, or the Hebrew word Sheol, which can be translated sometimes even as hell. It has been translated as that, the sort of the Hebrew understanding of that death place. Could I go there? If I went there, would God not find me? If I make the grave my bed, you are there also. That there's literally nowhere that I could go that would be too low, that it wouldn't be held account, that God, it wouldn't be in God's accounting for me, that God wouldn't, there's nowhere I could go that God wouldn't be able to be there with me and for me and about me. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand will lead me and your right hand hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will cover me and the light around me turn to night, darkness is not dark to you, O Lord. The night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light are both to you, are both alike. I mean, for you yourself created my inmost parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. The intimacy of this. I will thank you because I am marvelously made. Your works are wonderful and I know it well. My body was not hidden from you while I was being made in secret and woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my limbs, yet unfinished in the womb. All of them were written in your book. They were fashioned day by day, when as yet there was none of them. How deep I find your thoughts, O God. How great is the sum of them. If I were to count them, they would be more in number than the sand. To count them all, my lifespan would need to be like yours. And then he goes into like I hate everyone who hates you. It's a weird sort of ending for the psalm. But it's that sort of like his idea of righteousness and faithfulness to God is found in his recognition of God's godness, of God's wholeness, the all-encompassing reality, which is what I was talking about earlier, right? This idea that there's nowhere you could go that God isn't. And so his idea of righteousness and wickedness is not about being flawless and perfect or imperfect and weak, but the sort of in David's language and the psalmist's language of righteousness or wickedness is like those who are willing to recognize the fullness of God, and those who think that they can do things and God won't see, or that aren't going to be held accountable for, or that that there's a place you could go that God wouldn't be. I love that. Betsy said, you made us think this morning about our death and where we will be buried. Been thinking all afternoon. Thanks, ? So in Bible study today, we talked about the burial of Sarah. Abraham's wife Sarah dies, and Abraham buries her, and it's not a super romantic story, and it's really a lot of it has to do with about the acquiring of a plot of land for Sarah, and the implications of Abraham buying a plot of land. But what's really cool is the point is that there's up to the point in the story. She dies at 127 years old, which makes Abraham at the point, I think, 136. Good luck with that. But the idea being, in all of their years of marriage, but also in all of his years of life, once he sets out from his father's house, he's never owned his own piece of land. He's never owned his own piece of land. And he buys a piece of land. When the first piece of land he buys in the area that is the promised land, in the area that God promises to him in Canaan, the first piece of land he buys is a burial site for Sarah when she dies. And that becomes the seat of David's throne. It becomes this sort of claim on, this is how long we have owned this. Abraham owned this land, right? So there's a political element to it, unquestionably. But the spiritual element of where we're buried being the place that is sort of like the basis for what we consider home. And I was telling the group in my Bible study this morning, if I died today, I don't know where I'd be buried, right? Because I'm 40, first of all, not old enough that anyone expects me to go yet, but I've lived in Cincinnati now for 3.5 years. I'm a native Californian, but I lived in New England for many years. There's a couple places I've lived that I probably wouldn't be buried, right? Like I love North Carolina, but it's not home. And I love Virginia, but it's not home. But I have a big piece of me that's home when I'm in New Hampshire or Maine. And I have a big piece of me that's home when I'm in California. But every day, my wife and I and my family, we're constructing a sense of family here in Ohio. And this is our home. It's becoming our home. And so just this idea of where you're going to be buried, being a sort of staking a claim on or having larger implications about your understanding of who you are and where you belong. Abraham is made this promise by God, this covenant into which he enters with God, in which God says, go out. This is your part. You go and you go into the world and go to the place I'll tell you. So it's a call to be faithful, because it's go do the thing, go where God tells you to go, which is an act of faith, right? But then God's what God will do in his part of the bargain, which is pretty awesome, First of all, I'll show you where to go. I'll bless you. You'll be a blessing. I'll give you a name, which is to say he'll give him a great reputation and land and legacy, a heritage to a man who has no children. So which is all these things, which are the ways of understanding blessing in ancient Near East culture, would be land, having land, having people to give the land to, having a heritage, children, legacy, and livestock things, right? Like property, not just property, but stuff. God says, I'll do that stuff for you. Well, Abraham gets these things. He acquires a lot of livestock, acquires a lot of property, but not land. When I say property, I got to be careful. A lot of wealth. He acquires wealth. He acquires a great reputation. Eventually, he ends up having a child with Sarah, and then in Sarah's death, he finally, for the first time in the story, purchases land. And so all of the different aspects of God's promise come to fruition. But one of the holiest things is that this thing happens, that this land part is fulfilled in Sarah's death, and for the purpose of having the appropriate place for her and it belonging to them. This is the thing that spurs his decision. And so we're talking about this, and we talked about this for an hour in Bible study, and there was a lot of different aspects to it, right? But the thing that I kept coming back to was like, when they decided, he could have just said, I'm going to take her back to where we grew up, right? Like, she spent the first 70 years there. I'll take her back there. That makes the most sense. And we don't really have a home here. He says, I'm a sojourner. I'm a resident alien, right? I'm not technically from here. But he doesn't do that, right? He purchases land to create a burial space for his wife, and ends up being where he's buried as well, and where his children bury him. And in so doing, he's staking a claim on that space. So Betsy brought that up, made us think about our death and where we'll be buried. Thanks, ? And a lot of the people in our Bible study we have a columbarium at our church, which is a place for people's remains to be interred. We have that at Redeemer, and a lot of the people in our Bible study have already chosen spaces there, and they've talked about what it meant for them to be a spiritual home. And I got to be totally honest. Like, I've always had I've always been of two minds about having, people being buried at the church. I mean, nothing, I guess I shouldn't say two minds. It's never bad. Like, I've never been like, you shouldn't do that. People should do whatever they want to do. But I've always thought about, like, oh my gosh, like the responsibility a church bears and the emphasis on like this being a piece of property that's always going to be the church. And sometimes the church needs to be all sorts of things, as we're finding out right now. Right. But seeing all these people who love it. And Betsy is one of the people who's going to be buried at Redeemer. I didn't want to out you, Betsy. I thought that was yours to say, but you've just said it. So, so many people will say, this is where I want to be. This is my family. And then being in a room with these people, or in a Bible study with these people, where such a huge number of people are saying, my home is this church. And that's where I want my ashes to be. It's a powerful experience. That's a powerful statement about the beauty of that community, of our community. And so, I really love it. I really love it. Like, I really love it. Some of the people that aren't with us today that have asked questions but may watch this later, I want to tell you about something else that we realized in Bible study today. You won't have to go to Thursday morning Bible study if I tell you all the stuff that we just figured out. But we've talked a lot in the last couple of weeks about women's roles in the church, women's roles in the scriptures, about the patriarchal nature of a lot of this stuff, and about how we should be and how we can subvert the patriarchy, and how we can be faithful to scriptures and be faithful to our tradition in a way that does not that actually promotes feminism, promotes an understanding, a full understanding of the equality. Equality is such a legalistic word, but of the fullness of the gift to the world that women bring, and that we've got to move us away as a people from thinking of men as neutral and anything, and white men as neutral, or whatever kind of man is neutral, and then women as sort of complementary to that. But in the reality of like the full reality of humanity spanning these different gender understandings and all this, right? Why am I bringing all this up in terms of Bible study? So we talk about the promise to Abraham, right? Cool. And everybody's heard of it, the Abrahamic covenant, Abraham being the father of many nations. And we sang that song when I was a kid. Father Abraham had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham, and I'm one of them, and so are you, right? What's fascinating is when Isaac is born, it says that God paid attention to the promise he'd made Sarah, not Abraham. He doesn't mention Abraham. It mentions that God makes good on his promise to Sarah. The other thing that's really fascinating is I mentioned all of these different ways that Abraham acquires is all the ways that the blessing that Abraham experienced is realized. His name, his stature, his heritage, the land, and the wealth. Every single one of them is acquired through and because of directly Sarah, his wife. So she bears him the child. The property that he ends up getting is because of her, to find a place for her to die. The wealth that he gets is a funny story. There's these stories that are interesting, and there's two of them where when he goes for various reasons to settle in different places outside of where he was going to settle, and he's scared because he's a foreigner there and he has no rights and he doesn't know what they'll do. He thinks that they'll kill him and take his wife for themselves. So he tells Sarah, "Pretend you're my sister." Super weird, but she says okay, because Sarah just gets put through the ringer throughout Genesis, but other people end up marrying Sarah. In one case, the Pharaoh, in the other case, this King Abimelech. There's two like identical or nearly identical stories that are told from different authors and then redacted together. But they both have the same scenario, which is because of Sarah marrying this other person, Abraham acquires a bunch of wealth, and so his wealth is acquired through Sarah. His child is acquired through Sarah. His property is acquired because of Sarah. So I haven't figured out what to do with that yet. I'm still just trying to figure that out. But I wanted to bring it up because it's another example where even within the very clearly patriarchal story that's being told, there is this subversion of that patriarchy within the story being told by the patriarchal people, which is so clearly that the woman is instrumental in the blessing. And that the woman is clearly a vehicle of deliverance and blessing. We see this so fully in Exodus. That nothing could have happened in Exodus without the women in the story. And so even though it's no question that the people who are writing it have a very strong understanding of a patriarchal reality, even within that frame, in that context, and they write like that's true, even within all of that, they can't help but tell this story in a way that highlights the truth of the woman's contribution to the overall blessing of the world. All right. So we talked about John last week. We talked about Mary Magdalene, and I preached on that on Easter. Mary Magdalene being the first. John tells the story. She's the first person to proclaim, to have seen the risen Savior, and to proclaim the reality of that to others. She's the first apostle in that sense. She's an apostle to everybody else in that sense. And John is also the one where the longest conversation that Jesus has is with the woman at the well in Samaria. We got a sad kid. It's tough being a kid in all this, and hanging out with us all the time, right? Just hanging out with us all the time. That's the whole deal. There's a whole lot of it. He's in here. He's in here. But he's got poop.
Okay. I have some poop, baby.
Can you imagine just being that proud of yourself for going to the bathroom? It's amazing. It's amazing. No way that I could possibly remember what I was talking about after that. It's 4:54. It's not quite an hour, but I'm going to wrap it up. And thank you for your time. It's been an interesting one today. I hope I wasn't too rambly. We had fewer questions. I talked more. That's either good or bad. I don't know. We'll see. But I am still trying to figure out if we want to do this twice a week or once a week, trying to figure out how this thing works. Every day is an experiment, right? Every day we're just trying new things and new ways to make sure we feel connected to one another and that we are part of this thing together. It's also an opportunity for me to remind you how much I love you guys and how grateful I am that we get to do this together. I thank you for your input and your presence. So thanks, Mary and Jeff. Thank you, Betsy. Thanks, Kathy, for watching. John, I hope you got to watch it. Whoever else watches this later on, and just you're always feel free to email me with questions that you want me to answer or want me to respond to. And of course, you're always welcome to correct me when I make the multiplicity of mistakes that I'm capable of making. But I'll see you all on Sunday morning online. I'm looking forward to worshiping with you on Sunday. And I'm going to go hang out with some crying kids and see how that goes. All right. Much love to you all. Take care. If it works.